Good afternoon and welcome to the next part on the Major Arcana. Today we're going to be talking about the Emperor, who is the consort of the Empress who we talked about yesterday. So we're back to a masculine card. The past two cards we did were obviously feminine cards, and the cards before that were, more masculine cards. So as of yet, we're seeing things in pairs of two quasi-masculine cards, two very feminine cards, and then the next two are going to be two very masculine cards, the Emperor and the Hierophant. And then following that, we start getting into more interesting territory. But anywho, so today we're going to talk about or in this video, we're going to talk about the Emperor. And he is here. And like I said, he is the consort of the Empress. So he is the complement of her energy. As such, he is the alchemical essence of sulfur, which you can see by the fact that he has this triangular upper body and his legs are crossed. So essentially we have the triangle surmounted upon the cross, which is the alchemical symbol for sulfur. So the essence of sulfur is very hot, explosive, and sudden. It's energizing. In alchemy, it's essentially it's believed that salt needs to be energized by sulfur, basically. And the interaction between the two results in this fluidity, which is the third principle of mercury. And we've already talked about mercury in the magus. And we've of course talked about salt in the Empress. So now we have the Emperor as sulfur. So his personality is going to be very hot-tempered, very rash sometimes, sudden, quick to action, also a motivator to some extent, someone who does not like the doldrums, someone who likes to energize people into action. In some form. It might not always be pleasant. Because the card is also Aries, and not to offend any Aries people out there, but Arian people tend to be very quick-tempered, very passionate people who tend to follow instincts and heart in a kind of combination of the two, I think, before thinking out things logically. They're also very stubborn people usually, or the sign is known for being stubborn, being a ram, kind of combative sometimes, but in general very motivated people, people who like to be adventurous and try new things generally are usually optimistic people, but when provoked they can be difficult to deal with sometimes. This is not to say that other signs are not of this nature as well. Taurus is kind of along the similar lines as far as stubbornness. But that's the basic aspect of Aries that we're talking about here in terms of the Emperor. The other big aspect of Aries is that Aries is the first sign of the Zodiac. And Aries is very much about the sense of self. If you think about how Aries is connected to the first house, your first house, or basically your ascendant house, is very much about what kind of person you present to the world around you, your how you basically see yourself as an individual. So the Emperor is also very individualistic. I think that is where we get the main contrast between the Empress and the Emperor. While the Empress represents, in some ways, a representation of the universe, and the totality of the universe, how the entire universe is love, we talked about in the previous video. In this sense, we have the opposite of the universe. We have the individual. And we are essentially claiming that the individual themselves are, or is rather, lord of his or her own personal universe. Of course, this is kind of one of these deep metaphysical ideas that because everyone has a subjective perspective, and talking about before, we were talking about how if you have an infinite space, any point that you select in it arbitrarily can be considered the mathematical center of that space. So the idea is that any living unity can consider itself the center of the universe and therefore lord of its own universe, which is very interesting because then, of course, the question is raised, how does it all work out? How do we not have anarchy, really? And I think the response to that is, uh, I mean, I would say that it is because there is an overall will of the universe, and that each of us is endowed with what is called by some, true will or higher purpose, however you'd like to phrase it. But the idea is that, each of us has a path that is natural to us to take, natural for us to take, and it's kind of like an orbit, essentially, that we have um, a specific life path that we are designed to do very naturally. And it's when we deny ourselves this in, some form, and it could be because of pressures from society, um, or pressures just from others in general. It could be because of guilt complexes or something like that, anything along those lines, that is the basic idea of a sinful state, that is disobeying divine law. And of course, divine law is subjective for the individual. And of course, this gets into some moral backwater because, of course, the question again arises, well, how does that not result in anarchy? Um, and how do you deal with morality at all if everyone's morality is subjective? I think what I have read about psychology, it's morality is a very interesting thing, but there was a study done, and of course I can't remember the name of the actual psychologist, and of course this diminishes the credibility of my argument quite a lot. But his idea was that morality is something, of course, that takes stages in a human's life, and essentially, when you are an infant, you have no real sense of morality. You're like the fool. You don't have any sense of guilt. Everything is equally a viable option. And it isn't until trial and error, in parental guidance, really, societal guidance, that you really start to develop a sense of right and wrong. But you don't really know why. It's right and wrong. And that's really cemented when you are an adolescent and going through puberty, and you become a slightly more mature person. And of course, adolescents are incredibly sensitive to the opinions of others and their interactions with others, because it's perhaps the first time in your life where you feel very vulnerable, I think. So you're particularly sensitive to the appreciation of others. Um, and so you become much more concerned about societal norms, what is considered normal and abnormal. And this, of course, leads to a whole nest of vipers, because really, if we are all truly different, then there really is very little idea of normalcy. Of course, this is just a basic thing. Um, but the idea is, again, that you are very much, set in some sort of moral belief at that age, by society and parents and friends and that sort of thing. And then a lot of people tend to stay there, the psychologist suggests, that most people don't ever reach the third stage. And he says that the third stage is when an individual is willing to question the morality and the norms that they have learned and taken for granted. That real moral maturity and adult morality comes from reevaluating everything you've learned and testing it against the filter of your own personal experience, really. Um, and acknowledging that very little is true inherently, especially in terms of morality. It's that morality is very much a gray area, Um, but this psychologist does say that, what's interesting is that across the world, when replicating this study, that those individuals in different cultures and societies who have taken that step to reevaluate their positions on things, that they all tend to agree on the same things, that they all tend to agree that basic things like harming other individuals is wrong. Killing other things, other living things, is wrong. Especially other people who have not really done anything to you. Because of course, killing for food is one thing, and but that of course must be done responsibly. All these things, environmental awareness, just general things like that we kind of take for granted, but it makes a big difference whether or not you really believe that, or if you're just doing it because that's what you've always been taught. So my point of this is just getting back to the emperor, because the emperor is also, Dominus. He is the lord of his universe, and sees no other competition really, being Aries. And so I think it's very important for the emperor to be aware of his sense of morality, and to understand that he is really in control of his morality and his own law. Um, this is just, all getting around what he's about. His letter is the letter Tzaddi, according to our man Alistair. This is, of course, another big confusing thing. The emperor is in his deck one of the more confusing cards because of the change of attributions. Originally, it was presupposed that the emperor was the letter He, and therefore was the path on the Sephiroth connecting Chokhmah to Tiferet, or 2 to 6. And this would make a lot of sense, excuse me, at least the Chokhmah, to Tiferet part. But in the Book of the Law, Crowley's big, Bible, if you will, um, there is the phrase, all the letters of my book are right, but Tzaddi is not the star, because it was again with the emperor being He, number 17, the star was considered Tzaddi for a while. And so in the Book of the Law, in the Nuit chapter, chapter 1, she says that, all the letter attributions are right except Tzaddi is not the star. So of course Aleister Crowley went into just a long period of meditation on this, in which he couldn't really figure it out, and he was very frustrated by this because it didn't make sense. So eventually it dawned on him that the star had to be He, and the emperor had to be Tzaddi. The explanation for this, or the logical explanation for this, even though it makes sense based on letter, the legitimization for this was the Zodiac, basically. In the traditional order of the trumps, there is a weird abnormality centered around the Hermit card. Basically, all the trumps are normally in their astrological order, which is pretty interesting, except for strength or rather, lust and adjustment or justice. And essentially what happened is the sign of Libra as adjustment came first as number 8. And the sign of Leo ends up going after Virgo as lust or strength. So there's a loophole. Usually it would go, of course, Leo, Virgo, Libra, but in this case, in our order of the trumps, as is according to even the Marseille Tarot goes in this order, we have Libra as number 8, the Hermit as Virgo number 9, and then Strength, La Force, or Lust as number 11, with the Wheel of Fortune between them. But the idea is that there's this loop. Now, that is on the one side of the zodiac wheel. And now on the direct opposite side, you have the signs of Aries, Pisces going backwards, and then Aquarius. So essentially, Pisces is the opposite of the Hermit. I don't know if I'm explaining this well enough. So the idea was that since the two signs were switched around each other on one end, there must be some sort of loop or switch on the opposite end. So what he did was he switched the letters of Aquarius, the star, with that of the Emperor, Aries. So essentially, this is how we got to the idea that the sign of Aquarius, or the star, is really the letter He, and the Emperor is now Tzaddi. Long-winded explanation to explain that. But it's important because it changes a lot of his attributes. Being Tzaddi, Tzaddi means a fish hook, whereas He means a window. And that seems to make more sense to me. A fish hook is more of a masculine image as opposed to the feminine image of the star. It's a fish hook being associated with the fish. The fish is also a symbol of Christ and masculine gods, particularly resurrective gods. So it makes more sense, I think, in that light. And also, being Tzaddi now, he is on the 18th path of the Sephiroth, meaning now he connects the essence of Netzach to Yesod. So now he's way down the tree. So the interesting idea of this is that well, Netzach number 7 represents essentially the emotions and the individual's sense of bliss, or what is our concept of beautiful things and enjoyment and pleasure, and particularly in a way kind of sexual pleasure, but not necessarily. Whereas Yesod is a very interesting Sephirah that deals with the subconscious and fertility and essentially hermaphroditism to some extent, because it is Yesod means foundation, and so it is the final filter through which all the above forces of this tree of life are rectified, basically. It's sort of like the big computer of the universe that takes all these influences and basically says, well, there's too much of this, so I'm going to equal it all out, basically. It's the great equalizer. It stabilizes everything, fuses it together, and produces a final emanation in Malkut, which is the physical world, basically. So in Yesod, I would say, is contained a lot of these laws of physics in some ways, which is interesting given the fact that it's also this kind of, it's also the moon, and so it's got a sort of feminine aspect, but the subconscious wateriness. But all that being put aside, the Emperor connects the two. So this gives us a bunch of very interesting attributes, because in that case, we can see that the Emperor could represent the regulation of one's emotions to some extent, the idea of self-control in many ways. But it can, the other interesting aspect of it is that Crowley says that Yesod is associated with the Muladhara chakra, and the Muladhara is the root chakra, or basically the lowest, of the spinal chakras, and so it is very much associated with earthiness. This is interesting because Malkut is really more along those attributes, but he says that Yesod is associated with the sexual organs and therefore is similar to the Muladhara chakra. There are those who disagree with this attribution, Dion Fortune being one of them, but the idea was that Yesod is also the Sephirah of what is called the astral light. And the astral light is essentially that ambiguous substance from which things are made eventually, really. Um, so what am I getting at here? Uh, so the astral substance is what magicians traditionally are manipulating when you are performing a magical act. And the idea is that the sexual organs are one's personal toolkit to achieving very powerful magical results, basically. Because they are the powers of fertility and creativity and life that one can wield for whatever purpose, really. Um, and so there is this kind of connection between um, the astral in Yesod and the genitals on the human body in terms of using them as a magical tool. So what I'm getting at is that the Emperor being, if you put all this together, and if you remember that he is sulfur and is hot and explosive, essentially what I'm getting at is that the Emperor sort of gave it away. The Emperor is a representation of the orgasm being directed towards a specific purpose. It is the rousing of the passions in Netzach and controlling them towards shaping something in the physical world through the medium of the astral light in Yesod. Whether you agree with this or not is up to you, really. But having meditated on this and how we can reconcile the fact that suddenly the Emperor is no longer on the path connecting Chokhmah to Tiferet, which seems to make more sense, how do we then deal with the fact that he is now the 18th path, which doesn't seem to really make sense? But I think that works if you're using Crowley's system. Um, so yeah, there's a lot going on here. The other awkward part about this card is that in the Book of Thoth itself, Crowley, when describing the card, says that the light of the sun coming from here is actually the light of Chokhmah descending upon him, and that he is the organized man in Tiferet, essentially. This is, of course, a bizarre anomaly, and perhaps in that case we are meant to see the Emperor on multiple levels. Perhaps we're supposed to see it in a dual fashion, but he doesn't replicate that kind of viewpoint with the star. The star is the path from Chokhmah to Tiferet for Crowley. So it's an anomaly that no one really knows what to do with. We don't know if he wrote it before, or like what exactly was going on there, or what he intended. But I think it is interesting that it does function pretty well on both paths. Um, and I would say it's useful to think about it in terms of both paths, but really focus on the one that it's meant for, Netzach to Yesod, because of course Crowley, in designing this deck, intended us to think of it as connecting Netzach to Yesod. So its symbolism and everything else is planned accordingly. The interesting thing too is that Netzach is Venus, and Venus is the Empress. So in some extent, we might say that the Emperor is not only the consort of, but perhaps the emissary of the Empress. If the Empress is, Queen of the Universe and all that, then the Emperor is Lord of the Universe, but also the channeler of her energy, really, or what is latent in her energy, what is contained. He is that which releases it and actually creates something with it in the real world. So yes, again, we have the symbols of royalty on the bottom. The fleur-de-lis comes back. We have the Agnus Dei in the corner, which is interesting, the Lamb of God. And this is interesting given Crowley's vision of the Wheel of Fortune in the vision of in the Voice, Libra 418. In which he sees the Lamb of God on top of the wheel as crowning it, but as a sign of wickedness, as a sign of salt, that because the Lamb of God represents peace, it represents this idealistic sense of peace that is not harmonious with the universe. that the universe itself is based on motion and interaction of forces, and so any human idealistic notion of peace and rest is equivalent to death and is therefore the antithesis to life, and if God is life, then the symbols don't line up. So it does make sense. And so the emperor is he who has subjugated that idea, basically. In some ways, we might say that the emperor has established inner peace with himself, not so much peace around him, because remember, the emperor is an energizing force. So, so it's important not to get confused. The emperor does not represent peace. He is not a peacemaker at all, and he's never going to be. It's more representative, I think, if we're going to see it as a symbol of peace, more as an interior peace that comes from following one's true will, basically. You know, being in charge of one's personal universe. That sense of organization over one's affairs, metaphysically and physically, brings a sense of harmony between the two, and that's the closest idea of peace that you're going to get. You know, and the other clue that we have that Crowley doesn't particularly like the Agnus Dei is that it's mostly in darkness, giving us a clue to its nature. Of course, the Lamb of God is the symbol of Christ, and in that case, it is less a symbol of peace, I think, and more a symbol of the sacrifice of Christ and the redemption that Christ gives us by fulfilling His true will. And that's something for a whole other discussion. But I think the idea is that, you know, by showing the Agnus Dei in a negative light, Crowley is not necessarily hating on Jesus, even though, of course, we know Crowley is not particularly a big fan of Christianity or Judeo-Christian morality or principles. But I think he was largely against the Christianity of common people, of the masses, who tend to take the very difficult and esoteric concepts of Christianity and water them down to the point where that just becomes a symbol of general peace without really defining what that peace constitutes. You know, what exactly does peace mean to the average person? It usually means no war, no conflict whatsoever. Everyone, you know, the vision that Isaiah has of the peaceful mountain and all that, and you know, the lion and the lamb shall feed and all that, and a little child shall lead them. It's that sort of idea, and to some extent, that's not really a valid interpretation of the universe, if I may be so bold. I love Isaiah, but that's not quite how it really is. And again, that's more of an interior vision as opposed to an exterior reality. Okay, so I hope this was interesting, not too convoluted, not too long, 10 minutes longer than the others, but we talked about a lot of interesting things in this video. If you have anything to say about it, questions, comments, etc., leave them below. I'd be happy to receive them, think about them, all that, and respond to you if you've got a question. Okay, thank you very much, and I will see you in the next video for the Hierophant. Bye now.